My dear friends, seeing as you enjoyed the last format, the Down the Rabbit Hole, I thought we would do another Down the Rabbit Hole. And this one is a vintage Australian crime story. This is courtesy of 9 News Australia, the article that I found where we will branch off from and do our own investigating. But let's have a look at this story. It's about a serial killer could be behind vicious Sydney murders. And this happened in the 1930s. Let's have a look. Long before Ivan Milat left his mark on Australia's criminal history, another serial killer may have stalked Sydney's streets. It began on a hot morning on Saturday, December the 10th, 1932, when the naked body of a sex worker, Iris Marriott, who also went by the name of May Miller, was found raped and brutally beaten in Queen's Park under the flame-red flowers of a coral tree. Queen's Park, I've been through there many times when I lived in Australia. Wasn't far from where I lived at all. Less than a week later, another sex worker, Bessie O'Connor, was found barely breathing in a pool of her own blood, naked, within the Royal National Park in Sutherland. She too had been raped and beaten. She initially survived the attack but died the next morning in hospital. O'Connor's murder changed things. She came from a respected family from Redfern, and the media was quick to jump on the story of a crazed sex attacker. So now we'll put in the name of, first of all, we'll put in the name of Iris Marriott, who also went by the name of May Miller. Let's go and check her out.
Down the rabbit hole.
So this is a microfiche of newspapers of the time, and this article was actually written in 1949 about the murders in 1932. The reason why I'm going to this article is because the other ones tend to really concentrate on his confession, also the alleged murderer, his confession and the description of what he had to say. This actually describes Iris Marriott, or May Miller, her alias, a bit more than the other articles. Now what they've done is they've used a scanner to reprint what is written here. Sometimes there's mistakes. The robot doesn't do it perfectly, so we'll just get around. I'm not going to read it all out, just the interesting bits. So the killer's worst enemy was his specialized knowledge of knots. When towards the close of 1932, one after another, 3 women were found slain in lonely places in curiously identical circumstances. A wave of horror and indignation spread through the state. But for 2 unusual features, which were in fact 2 most unusual knots, all 3 of these horrible crimes might have gone into the police files marked unsolved. As it was, for 2 of the slayings, a killer was sent to jail, his papers marked never to be released. The 3rd murder was never solved. We'll get to that too a bit later. So a passer-by, early in the morning of December the 10th, 1932, found a woman lying sprawled among some bushes at the eastern end of Queen's Park, Waverley, near Victoria Street, and only a minute or 2 from the bus at Carrington and Darley Roads, and close to several houses which faced the wide area of parklands. Stripped almost nude, she had been beaten to death. The poor broken body had been there since the evening before. A billet of wood lying nearby told its own story. The killer, his work done, had trussed up the body, tied a knot with part of the clothing, and dragged the body away from the well-used tracks in the hope perhaps that it might not be found too easily. The police came. It did not take them long to establish the victim's identity. She was May Miller, well on to middle age. Can I just pause there? She's probably about 30 or something. I wonder how old she was, if we'll find that out. Middle age back then was probably a lot different how we'd class middle age nowadays. And this is a curious insight how they talked about women back then who were from the poorer end of the neighborhood. They described her as a human wreck who lived by scrounging around the parks and picking up any stray man who cared to go away with her. There were no outstanding clues except one, and that one was a peculiar knot which indicated that the killer was a man with some special kind of training in rope work. So they talk about a stolen car abandoned in Cook Road, Centennial Park. Now Centennial Park was only about 2 minutes away from where I lived. So they're talking here about the other woman. In August 1932, another woman had been found murdered in Centennial Park. That woman was Hilda White. We'll have a look at those articles too a bit later. A man arrested and charged with having murdered her was discharged by the city coroner. Plainly, he was not the culprit, and the killing of Hilda White went down in the records as unsolved. Now, on December the 15th, 1932, almost a week after the finding of May Miller in Queen's Park, the nude body of Pretty Bessie O'Connor, top-class swimmer and fine athlete, was found battered and dead in National Park. She had been killed in almost the same way as May Miller. Attacked with some heavy instrument, possibly a tomahawk, she had been stripped of her clothing and left lying in the scrub. So, and it says, and there, as the police feverishly worked at the scene of the new murder and minutely studied every article found on the scene, they discovered the same knot. Now, of course, they've got to get their investigative work underway now because this girl's come from a good family. So, excuse me for being so cynical, but it doesn't really change much, has it? It still goes on today. If you come from a prominent, influential family, then they're going to do a bit more looking into it. Where do we go here? Bessie O'Connor, living in Holden Street, Redfern. Redfern back then was quite a well-to-do neighbourhood. Now it's really run down and a lot of drug addiction, alcohol, and violent crime. They're trying to. I think the yuppies are trying to inhabit it and try and get it a bit more upmarket because it's so close to the city. I don't know how that's going. It's been many years since I've been to Australia. Perhaps any Australian people can tell me. She had only just turned 16 and was a member of the Randwick Coogee Ladies Swimming Club. Now, Randwick was where I lived. That was my place where I lived for 14 years. Her brother, Arthur O'Connor, was one of Australia's greatest divers. So on the evening of December the 14th, she went for a swim, came home in a hurry, sang out to her mother that she was going out again, and left as hurriedly as she had returned. She was not seen alive again. So it talks about here about the police using photographs of groups taken much earlier, working on the assumption that the man for whom they were searching had left the army. Oil was struck almost straight away. The man was 26-year-old Eric Roland Craig, one-time artilleryman, later an employee of a city store. Craig lived with his wife and 2 children, one girl aged 2.5 and a boy aged 18 months, at a residential, 386 Park Road, Moore Park. For 2 years, Craig had been in and out of work and for 6 months had lived with his family, first in Queen Street, Woollahra, and then at the house in Park Road. Now, Queen Street, Woollahra is like a top end. You know, all the high-end shops are there. Back then, it was quite a poor neighbourhood. It's interesting how things change. I would say this is part of his confession. Some reports say that the confession was coerced, but it's basically describing what happened to May Miller. The Miller slaying was a sordid business. At 7 o'clock on the evening before the morning on which she was found, Craig went to the city, hung around a billiards room for an hour or so, wandered out again, saw a car in Goulburn Street, drove it away towards his home, and as he was passing by Greens Road, Paddington, was hailed by a woman who turned out to be May Miller. Paddington is just up the road from Woollahra, or just down the road actually. Was also a poor working-class neighbourhood back then. Now it's very upmarket as well. The woman asked to be driven home. He agreed. She directed him to a spot near Queen's Park, but instead of leaving him to go his way, she invited him to enter the park with her. The woman asked him for money. He said he had none. She protested that he had brought her there for nothing. She swore at him, then attacked him. He knocked her down. This is, of course, his side of the story. As he said afterwards, he lost his head completely. Handy to his hands was a piece of wood. Handy? How handy is it having a piece of wood in your car? Okay, sounds premeditated to me. This he picked up, and with it he battered her to death. Craig was committed for trial, and when later he was brought before a jury at the Darlinghurst Criminal Court in March 1933, he was found guilty and he was sentenced to 20 years for what was regarded as manslaughter. How the hell did they come to that? Verdict, manslaughter. Okay, well, he's because of his claim of self-defense that she attacked him. So the woman at Tom Ugly's, this was a kiosk. The woman who ran that kiosk positively identified him as the man she had seen with Bessie. Now, Bessie was the 16-year-old girl who came from the good family who also was murdered. So she positively identified him. So he's been seen with May Miller and Bessie O'Connor. Craig claimed he knew nothing of the killing of Bessie O'Connor. Now, it's either an amazing coincidence or he's lying through his teeth. Again, talking about the trial on the second murder charge. The first two juries then tried him, disagreed. At his third, in June 1933, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. Right through, he protested his innocence. Suddenly, a sensational twist was given to the evidence when a girl named Bonnie Murphy claimed that the man who was with Bessie O'Connor the night she was taken to National Park and her death was not Craig. This girl could be lying too. She claimed that the man who killed the girl was named George, but George was never found. So a further appeal to the High Court failed, and in September Cabinet commuted the death sentence to life imprisonment. The world will never see him again. I'll tell you a bit later they did. On his papers are the ominous words, never to be released. Only one loose end remains. Who had slain the now forgotten Hilda White? So this is the paper here. The headline is, Under the Kindly Trees They Found the Broken Bodies. Here's a picture of people there in the park. Here is Bessie O'Connor. There are no actual photos, only these newspaper reproductions of the photos. So let's bring Bessie back to life, at least artificially, after all these decades. Give her a bit of animation. I bet she would never ever imagine that we would be discussing her case all this time afterwards, here in 2021, a case that is actually not very well known at all, even by Australians. It's probably only that article from 9 News that has brought it to some people's attention. Otherwise, it's been basically forgotten about. And this is May Miller, who they said was middle-aged. I doubt it very much. And this is the chap who has been accused of the murders, Eric Rowland Craig, never to be released. So let's go back to the 9 News article again and check that out. So going back to the article, and by the way, all credit to Raffaella Ciccarelli. Ciccarelli or Cittarelli? Excuse me if I pronounce your name wrong, but all credit to you for this article, written in 2020, last year. We take off where we left off. This is the newspaper article at the time of the victims. Apparently, Bessie O'Connor whispered a clue. Frank, Frank, she gasped with her dying breath. Who was Frank? I wonder, was it a family member, or was she actually naming the murderer? We don't know about that. So, spurred by media and public pressure, the police quickly set their sights on a suspect, Eric Rowland Craig, a man later sentenced to death for the murder of O'Connor. A pattern of vicious public murders. Tanya Bretherton is the author of The Killing Streets, a book which details the cases. She believes the murders could possibly be the work of a serial killer. Through her research, she discovered a third woman, Hilda White, also a sex worker, had been murdered in July 1932. Like the others, White's body was found naked, beaten and raped under a fig tree in Centennial Park in Sydney's east. Of course, nowadays DNA would quickly sort out who was the murderer if he had come under the detective's magnifying glass. A reward offered. Did you see Hilda White? Detectives are asking the public to help them in their task of tracing the murderer of Hilda White, who was found strangled in Centennial Park on July the 30th, 1932. We'll have a look at those articles afterwards. It was the cluster of cases in 1932 that really had me first going backwards and then forwards to see if there was a pattern, she told 9news.com.au. It was when I saw Bessie was the third that year, I thought there's something not right here. After more digging, Bretherton noticed more cases that fit the pattern, scores of murdered women found beaten, naked and raped, spanning back to 1922 and past 1932 to 1946. Of course, I'm not sure whether those murders are linked after such a big span of time. It's just back then it was very hard detective work. An anonymous killer, an opportunity killer, could basically get away with it. There may have been several of these murderers operating. But anyway, they have a map of possible links in the Sydney murders. It's 10 women over the course of a 25-year period that I uncovered, Bretherton said, because the majority were all found in the eastern suburbs, and from what we know, most, with some exceptions, were working as prostitutes in a similar area of Sydney. I think they were related. Quite a long span for a serial killer. I'm not saying it's impossible, just quite lengthy. What do you think? Bretherton believes Eric Roland Craig was innocent. And we're going to have a look at the articles in the newspaper, the microfiche, something that I found before which may be of interest. She said he was convicted on scant evidence, and detectives in 1933 used controversial interview tactics to coerce a confession. Here we have a profile of Mr. Eric Roland Craig. Everything we know now about how it is possible to extract a false confession from someone was right there on the night when they got the confession out of Craig, she said. He was under duress, he had been held for a long period of time, and the police lied openly about how much evidence was against him. Well, it's normal. Detectives still do that today. They try and, they try and prompt a confession by saying they have a lot of evidence against the suspect, hoping that he will, fess up. After enduring 3 trials, Craig received a manslaughter conviction for Marriott's death and was sentenced to death penalty for the murder of Bessie O'Connor. However, this was commuted to a life sentence. He was eventually released from prison and went on to have another life, changing his name, building a house in Maryland, and remarrying. Bretherton said there is no way an alternative suspect can be found because most of the murder cases weren't properly investigated at the time. Well, as I said before, they just, they didn't have the technology we have today. It was pretty much impossible to find someone who, if they've killed in the darkness of a park, no one's seen them. They don't have the tracing techniques. With the detectives back then, they sort of look like mafia guys, don't they? A lot of the detectives back then look like sort of thugs in suits. I love that photo, though. This was because the women were all sex workers. Of course, that's a valid point. Sex workers' crimes would definitely not have been that thoroughly investigated. I was shocked more had not been done to investigate what were really horrible and public crimes. It was just not high priority for the police because the women were prostitutes. Pretty much the same today, isn't it? Unfortunately. Values of the time being as they were, what the women did as work was viewed very dimly. It hasn't changed much, really, has it? I know it was a different era with limited forensics, but even understanding of all that, the level of judgment brought to bear on these women was very real. Yeah, they were a bit in the newspaper articles. They were a bit sort of a bit heavy-handed the way they described these women. I agree with that. More disturbing than the prospect of an unidentified serial killer is the prospect the murders could be the work of multiple killers, Bretherton said. I tend to think so. I think there was a lot of murders that didn't even get into the news back then. Bodies are just hidden. They were never found again. What's more frightening about this is that at any point in Sydney's history, there's clearly more than one person capable of doing this. It's possible that over the course of 25 years, it could have been more than one guy. Anyway, let's continue with the newspaper articles and see if we can sum this case up. So this is another newspaper article from that time, January 1933. Frightened and tried to hide her in the bush, mental torture described in the alleged confession. I killed her, she kicked me. Park horror inquest sensations. This is, by the way, by the Truth newspaper. The Truth is a bit like the Sun or the National Enquirer. It's sort of tabloid trash of the time. But there was a part I want to show you. It goes through the whole description of the wounds of the body. It's a bit gruesome. And we're going to look down here because this is part of the police interrogation. I'm going to zoom in. So they are questioning him here about a stolen car, an Essex Tourer, which at first he had denied stealing. Then the detectives said, I understand the only time you were away from your home on December the 9th was between 9 and 9:45. And Craig said yes. McRae, who is the detective, said, you stated that you only had 3 torches and showed him 3 torches. He had another small torch in his hand and said to Craig, this torch was found in your room tonight. Craig said, I forgot about that one. I found it in Centennial Park just inside the Queen Street gates when I took my little girl for a walk on December the 10th. I've been through those gates many times, actually. McRae said that torch was stolen from an Essex touring car which had been stolen from Elizabeth Street near Goulburn Street on the night of December the 9th. Craig said, I know nothing about that. So he's denying any knowledge of stealing the car. McRae then showed him a lady's cardigan jumper and said, this was also found in your room tonight. Craig said, that belongs to my wife. And McRae said, your wife denies all knowledge of it. Would you know your wife's signature? And Craig said, yes. McRae then showed him what his wife had signed. McRae also showed him a jacket and said, this was stolen from the car that night. Did you steal it? Craig said, no, I did not. McRae then said, well, how do you account for the torch and the jumper? And then Craig said, oh, well, I did steal the car. Okay, so now he's admitting to stealing the car, and the reason why this is important is because the detectives believe that the car was used in the murder of that poor lady. Here we have it. Detective Inspector Miller, continuing, said that we have reason to believe that the car was used in connection with the murder of Iris Marriott on that night. Craig then said, I know what is coming next. Miller said, what do you mean? He put his hands on his head and said, I must have been mad. Miller then said, we are now going to charge you with the murder of the girl, Marriott. We are going to ask you further questions you are not obliged to answer. What do you think, my dear friends? Was he the murderer? So this boy here, he is the one who found the body of the poor mutilated woman, viciously beaten, and it must have been horrible for him to witness that. Above is an exclusive photo of the suspect's mother and his sweet-featured girl wife, standing with a friend. Of course, it is possible that the detectives forced a confession out of him, that one of the detectives had been accused of assaulting the suspect and beating him in the interrogation room. It could be true. And this is why the detectives believed that the car was used in the murder, which he admitted stealing that car. Why didn't he admit to stealing the car before? It's not like a murder charge, it's just a charge of theft. I think the reason why he didn't admit to it because the car was probably involved in the murder. Then McRae said to Craig what his wife had signed, and Craig then admitted that he did steal the car and took the coat and torch from it. He added that he stole the car near Goulburn Street, drove up. Just to clarify something here, the boy said he had saw an Essex tourer near the park where the body had been found. He added that he stole the car near Goulburn Street, drove up 2 or 3 streets, took the coat and torch and walked home. He said that he had arrived at his home that night about 11 p.m. Now remember, his earlier statement, he said 9:45 p.m. and that's a big discrepancy. Why is he trying to cover up that time? That is the time when the murder obviously took place. Detective Inspector Miller then said to the accused, we have every reason to think that the motor car was used in connection with the murder of May Miller on the same night. Craig replied, I did not murder her. Miller then said to Craig, a bag stolen from this car and certain tools were found in a garden plot in Cuthbert Street, not far from the place where the body was found at 11:30 p.m. on the night you took the car. Of course, we only have the police here say that the car was involved in the murder. It may not have been involved in the murder. We only have their word for it. But the fact that he lied about the time that he got home is somewhat suspicious. Let's have a look at a few more articles before we wrap up the case, my dear oddites. So, my dear friends, now time for the summing up. This is the Truth newspaper, once again, Sydney, Sunday, April the 2nd, 1933. And we see the main headline, Craig's agony of suspense. The jury cannot agree. Bessie O'Connor crime unsolved. So that murder was at a very similar time. That has been unsolved. There is one secret witness who they have brought forward, who was a garage owner, who said that Craig came to his garage that night with the Essex tourer. The radiator was boiling He wanted more water put in it, and that garage owner identified Craig from a police lineup, saying it was the same man but not as tanned, and that Craig was now clean shaven. This is poor Bessie, and it's interesting about, before we reach the description that the garage owner said, this is quite an important part, wheel tracks at National Park made by the murder car. The photograph was taken shortly after the tragedy had been discovered. The photo is quite terrible. You can see a silhouette of a car there, but they're saying it's the same tracks, so that car must have been used in the murder. And here we have the witness, the garage owner, describing the girl. She had a smiling, happy face, lips rather straight, a fairly wide mouth, rather bright eyes, and I fancy she had a string of beads round her neck. And there, of course, we see the beads around the neck. Very pretty girl. So we have that newspaper. We will now go to the next. And here we can see Craig is described as a modern Jekyll and Hyde. Accused man's few halting words from the dock. So the newspapers went into great detail back in those days. We don't have time to read all of it, so we're going to get to the interesting bits. This is Craig's confession about what happened that night. I'm going to have to read from the newspaper directly because the scan of the writing is terrible. It just doesn't make any sense. So he was saying, I was in the billiard room about half an hour. I left the billiard room, walked up Pitt Street to Goulburn Street, where I saw an Essex tourer standing between Goulburn and Liverpool Streets. I got into the car and drove up Oxford Street to Flinders Street to Park Road to Greens Road. May Miller was standing in Greens Road. She whistled to me and I stopped the car. She walked up to the car and got into it. She said, will you drive me home? I'll tell you where to go. I said, all right. I drove up Park Road to Queen Street, along Oxford Street, past the tram sheds to Denison Street. She said, go down here. I drove down Denison Street and she said, go straight down until you come to the park. I drove down Denison Street to Queen's Park. When we got to the corner near the park, she said, turn this way. I turned up to the left along Victoria Road to a dead end. She said, I live over there, and pointed to a house on the opposite side of the street. She said, what about coming into the park for a while, love? I said, all right. We got out of the car, which we left on the right-hand side of the road facing the steps. We walked through some long grass under a white railing. She led the way. We went under a coral tree and sat down. We talked for a while and she said, give us $1. I have no money. She said, come on, you have $1. I said, I have not any money. She said, haven't you any money at all? You didn't bring me out here for nothing. I said, I did not bring you. You lived here. With that she stood up and said, you are a bleep of a man, bringing a woman all this way. For 2 bleep pins I will kick you. I started to laugh. With that she slung a punch at me. I said, you dirty bleep. I stepped in close to her. She brought up her knee and hit me on the thigh with it. I knocked her down with my fist and I lost my head. I think I must have gone mad. I picked up a piece of wood and hit her. After I had seen what I did, I was frightened and tried to hide her in the bush. I took off her clothing as I thought they would not know her. I took her shoes and stockings off, and I took her overcoat and bloomers and her slip and rolled them in a bit of paper which I got from the car. So this shows where he's making his escape. Then I went home. I had some blood on my hands and washed them under the tap outside the kitchen. The only things I took from the car were a torch and a sweater, which were shown to me by Detective Sergeant McRae. I am sorry for what I have done. I have been mad ever since. I don't know what came over me. I seemed to go mad when she kicked me with her knee. This part here, the newspaper print is very smudged and the scan of it makes no sense at all. I'm going to do my best to read it. The suspect has further stated, I didn't think I killed this woman. The words were hardly audible through the choking sobs that shook Craig's frame. I never saw her in my life before. She called me a bleep. She came at me like a fury. I told the police, that's all, gentlemen. So here, I think this might be from the defense. They are describing May Miller as a fiend incarnate because she bit a man's ear. So this was the third woman that was killed in that time frame, and this is December. So this is quite important. This is December 1932. Craig was already apprehended for the first murder, so this is definitely not him. He's not responsible for this. Social outcast battered to death. Fiendish murder in deserted park. I have no idea how many people have been killed in Centennial Park over the decades, but it must be a lot. There must be plenty of ghosts roaming through there. Even when I was living there in the 80s, quite a few people had been killed, including Sally Ann Huckstep. That was a very famous case. She was a prostitute whistleblower about police corruption, and it turned out they dumped her body in the lake in Centennial Park, by the way, and she had initiated a crusade against police corruption after her boyfriend, who was a small-time criminal, after a corrupt detective shot and killed him. That's what she accused him of, and stole the $10,000 that he had on him. And later she became a police informant and was seen by the underworld figures with these two detectives. She was given information to them about underworld connections to corrupt police, and that was the reason why she was taken out. And one criminal who was a part of this underworld admitted to a cellmate that he had murdered her in the park, and he was being recorded unbeknownst to him. We may cover that story one day. So this poor woman, Hilda White, was she the victim of the same maniac? Well, she can't be, can she? This was after Craig went to trial. So maybe they're saying they're not sure that Craig did the murder. No clue to the murderer of May Miller, 30, a woman of no fixed abode whose nude body was found in Queen's Park, Waverley, yesterday morning, had been found up till the early hours of this morning. That doesn't really make sense, does it? Nor could the detectives discover a motive for the crime. So this is prior to that newspaper. This is August the 28th, 1932. They're trying to find a killer. This Russian guy had been accused. He was living in the same boarding house as her, but he claimed never to have spoken to her. The other neighbors said he was a very polite, respectable man who kept to himself. They didn't identify him because the killer was wearing a yellow gabardine, but the people who knew him said that he didn't own such a coat. And this is the poor woman, the murdered woman, Hilda White, again in Centennial Park. Roaming with ghosts, that park. So that murder remains unsolved. She was apparently of weak intellect, and that was her mental disability. She didn't work except assist around the house and run messages. Looks like, according to what witnesses say, that she would go out at night and that she associated with men, probably to make a bit of extra cash on the side. It was hard times, of course, in the 30s. So we now go forward to 1946, and this is a report about conditions in jails. And the highlight here is saying that certain life sentence prisoners, principally Eric Roland Craig, were allowed privileges not given to other prisoners. And now we are going forward to 1950, and we see that Craig's wife, who had become his ex-wife, also he was sentenced to death for the murder of 16-year-old Bessie Connor. I thought it was the other woman. It gets very confusing, doesn't it? I thought it was for May Miller. So he was sentenced to death for that. Yeah, he got 20 years instead of the death sentence. For the manslaughter of May Miller. I thought they said that murder was unsolved. Do you remember reading that? It's a bit confusing. Okay. So it turns out that his wife, who had divorced him, killed herself in a gas-filled Randwick flat this week. Randwick was where I lived. Mrs. Mann, 36, who was living apart from her second husband, was found by her father on Tuesday in her flat at 16 Glebe Street, Randwick. I know it well. One of her 2 children, a 20-year-old daughter, had been missing for a week. This is terrible. What's happening to all the women back then? And after that, I cannot find any more trace of Mr. Craig, apart from that initial newspaper, that recent newspaper report that he had retired to Marylands after that and disappeared from sight, dropped out of sight. So before we finish up for this episode, I just was thinking about how many people had been killed in Centennial Park over the decades. I can't really find a figure, but this is an article that was published 9 years ago, Centennial Park, A Dramatic Past and Present. They were saying that I think this is the first recorded incident. In 1851, two pistol-armed men met for a duel. One of them was to become the first Premier of New South Wales. Back then, we called it Lachlan Swamps. Okay. It was also here some 130 years later that a young woman with links to Sydney's underworld was found strangled and floating in a pond. That was the case I told you about, Sally Ann Huckstep. And again in 2009, the park became a crime scene when the body of a Redfern sound equipment rigger was found with stab wounds in the bushes close to Busby's Pond. But I can confirm there's been a lot of deaths in that park. I remember when I lived there was drug addicts found from overdoses. Not all of them were murders, of course, but a lot of dead bodies. It's a big park, very similar to Hyde Park in London. There's been homeless people found dead. There's a lot of murders which they're not mentioning here. It would be interesting if somebody did a count, since the park was open, how many people were killed. It says here in 1921, a police constable from Paddington, Frederick Walgast, was shot dead while chasing a gang of thieves. 30 years later, 4 teenagers were found guilty of raping a 19-year-old woman there. And there we go, they mention again Sally Ann Huckstep. Yes, there's a lot of ghosts in Centennial Park. That's for sure. Anyway, I'm going to wind up now. So do you think that Craig killed her, or was he framed by the police? Did they just want to find a killer? Did they just want to find someone to take the rap so they could close the case? Hard to say, isn't it? Because it certainly looks like, by the confession, if it wasn't coerced, it seems in court that he is basically admitting to it. So, yeah, but I would say he was definitely not the only one doing killings at that time. Yeah, it's a bit of a confusing case for me. I don't know about you. We'll go back to the traditional format after this for a while, but let me know what you thought of that. Do you like me going through the newspaper microfiche, or do you find it boring? I don't mind if you tell me. I want to know whether you like this or whether you don't like it. It is a bit similar to the previous one about the mausoleum, slightly different. Anyway, you can let me know what you think of this, whether I should continue with the old newspaper microfiche. Not for the main presentations, of course, just for the middle of the month ones. One thing I'd like to share with you before I wrap it up, this watercolour was actually done by me, was a Federation mansion that I lived in all those years when I lived in Randwick. It was built in the early 1900s. This is not all of the mansion. This is just the top part of it. It actually goes back quite a distance to the rear, and there is dwellings, below. It had been converted into apartments. The family who owned it lived below. They were Lebanese, beautiful people, really nice. I actually did this watercolor for them. I just have a photograph of it. I gave it to them. They're all dead now. They were just really lovely people. It was a brother and his 2 sisters. They treated me like their son. They were really so nice. And when I was leaving, they were all in tears. I think I had a few in my eye as well. It was such a sad parting. Yeah, so I occupied the top floor there. And actually I did the watercolor of the whole house. But I just, when I had it framed, I just framed the top half of it. Yes, it was it had actually been originally bought by a knight, an English knight, and he bought the 3 houses next to it, which were also identical in build. One part of my apartment, the front part, was his master bedroom, and the other houses were for his servants, apparently. Oh, an interesting history to it. And the house still stands to this day. That was an amazing old place. Amazing old place, my dear. I thought I would share that with you, my dear friends. The balcony is made of wood, with wooden pillars. It was great fun. We used to have parties there. Amazing times. Amazing times a long time ago. And on that note, I will bid you farewell, my dear friends. Take care, God bless, and bye-bye.